Good morning and welcome to the Future You live session on funding postgraduate study. My name is Guy Chester. I'll be chairing the session, and in a few moments I'll hand you over to Chris Ree from Prospects, who will be giving the presentation. I just wanted to point out, if you have any questions during the presentation that you'd like us to answer on the subject, then please use the Q&A function to get those questions over to us. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end of the session. So I think we're ready to start, and I'll hand you over to Chris now. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Guy, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the session. Postgraduate study has never been more popular. It's still a booming industry, and thousands of students enter postgraduate study every year. The funding question has always been an important one, and there's a lot of ground to cover, which we're going to do over the next 20 minutes or so. If you could pop onto the next slide, please. Everything that I'm going to talk about is covered in much greater depth and detail on the funding postgraduate study pages on prospectsac.uk. They've been very recently updated, so they are really your best resource to go to if you're thinking about postgraduate study. What I'm going to be talking about is pitched mainly at UK and at the moment EU students, less so for international students. If you're an international student listening in, there will be a lot that's useful for you, but your best source of reference for specifics on scholarships, etc., is the British Council and your international office at the university you're studying at. If we could pop onto the next slide, because before we start talking about funding itself, there are some important questions you need to ask, which I'm sure you're doing anyway. Some really good reasons to do postgraduate study. Employability is far and away number one, and that is doing a master's or a PhD or another form of further study to improve your career prospects, your job prospects, get a better job, get a pay rise, improve your personal development and your skills. Tied in with that, fulfillment, which should naturally come from doing a postgraduate course in any case, and personal development, but not necessarily for employment reasons, perhaps just because you love a subject so much and you want to enrich academic work and keep a subject alive. They're really good reasons to do postgraduate study. There are some less great reasons, which we shall look at now, please. And on their own terms, they are not necessarily disadvantages, but they should not be reasons in themselves. Retaining a student lifestyle, well, whatever your lifestyle has been like as an undergraduate, it will be very different at postgraduate level, because postgraduate study is generally much more self-directed and frankly sometimes more of a solitary experience, and it's compressed into a shorter period of time. Staying somewhere because your family, partner, friends are there, again, that might be an incidental benefit, but it's not necessarily the main reason for doing it. And finally, just because you don't know what to do with yourself, don't do an expensive and time-consuming and commitment-heavy course of study. Perhaps get a job instead and think about your options and take more time to make your decision. So that's just to be clear at the outset. It should always be about the course, what's right for you, where it's right for you, and what the right time is. So if we could move to the next slide, please, we'll start looking at the types of postgraduate funding that are available. And for many years, when we used to talk about postgraduate funding, it went pretty much like this. Postgraduate study is very popular, more people are doing it than ever before, but funding has not kept pace with that growth. And that the message usually was, be prepared to work and study at the same time, or support yourself in other ways. And while that is still true, and we'll look at that a little later on, everything changed in 2016 with the introduction of the postgraduate loan schemes for taught courses. So you'll see, whether in England, Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland, varying amounts provided through those main agencies. That really transformed the landscape, and it contributed to a big increase in postgraduate study from 2016 onwards, because although these are still loans and they get wrapped up very often in the undergraduate loan that you may be taking out of university with you, it still encouraged many more students who perhaps otherwise would not have been able to, or would not have thought about postgraduate study, to actually do a course. It was shortly followed on the next slide, please, by excuse me, the PhD loan scheme. So a similarly comprehensive system. This is in England and Wales for research students. So in both areas, research and taught courses, a national comprehensive loan scheme provision for the first time ever really did transform the landscape. But they are not the only sources of funding. So we should now look at some of the more significant, what you might call national schemes. On the next slide, please, if you could move over to that. Disabled students' allowances, they cut across all sorts of different types of funding, and they are, again, provided through the main funding agencies and statutory agencies. So if that's something that you're eligible for or need to look into, that's where you need to go to look for disabled students' allowances. On the next slide, please. Teacher training, comprehensive funding has always been the case for teacher training. So if you're thinking of doing a PGCE or some other form of teacher training and qualifying course, go to teaching at gov.uk, Student Finance Wales, Student Awards Agency Scotland, or NI Direct, initial teacher training. And there's a lot of scholarships and a lot of awards across all sorts of different subjects if you're thinking of going into teaching. If we could move on to the next slide, if we would. The other major source of funding, and this is in research, are the research councils. And as you see from the screen, there's 7 of them altogether, and they cover pretty much every area of academic work and activity and subject of study that you can imagine. Now, research council funding is almost always provided through the university department itself, so you do not apply directly to the research council. The funding comes in form of a stipend, and which covers your fees and also for cost of living, etc. And they work out very, very favourably, and they are highly desirable forms of funding. And there are thousands of them made available every year. And as is so often the case at postgraduate level, it's up to you to find out which one of the research councils is relevant to you if you are doing a research programme, and then of course which university departments are offering, and then get as much help as you can with the application and to make sure you make the best possible case. But even if you're not applying for research council funding or not even doing a research course, the research councils, as we just have a look on the next slide, do provide an awful lot of fantastic information about the areas that they work in. So we just take the one, for example, the BBSRC. Their websites are a very, very rich repository and resource for the latest research, the latest knowledge, cutting edge insights and intelligence from those areas of study. So as somebody embarking on another level of education, they are incredibly useful places to go to, even if you're not going to them to find out about funding. So do make the research councils part of your overall information and resource package. If we could move to the next slide, please. We now come to an area that's sort of hard to describe because it covers so many different types of organisation, different types of body. It's charities, foundations, and trusts. It's a bit of an unwieldy term, but it's the best one we can come up with. It's sometimes referred to as alternative funding. Now, this describes actually hundreds and worldwide thousands of organisations of different size, different scale and scope who have one thing in common, and that is they provide forms of postgraduate funding. Now, those may be ranging from full scholarships and awards right down to small grants or bursaries for travel expenses or research materials or hardship relief, etc. They often are in sector-specific or subject-specific areas. So, for example, every disease, malady, ailment and condition will have a charity or a research foundation attached to it, which is dedicated to doing research and improving knowledge in those areas and support. And they will very often, because they're concerned to keep the subject alive and developing, they will often have funding for postgraduate study and other forms of training. So again, if in your particular area of study, it's important that you get to know which bodies are relevant to you, and then of course find out how the application process works, how the eligibility criteria work as well. And again, there is no standard set of processes or rules or requirements. They often work in very different ways. Sometimes their application process may be every 2 years. They may be for students of a certain type or from a certain region. And it's important that you get to know how all of this works, because often this funding is not always taken up simply because, firstly, students aren't necessarily aware of the opportunities that exist. And secondly, if they are, they may not make the correct application, or they may overlook a certain aspect of the eligibility criteria, which is a pity, because many students that we've talked to over the years have got an important contribution to their overall funding package from a charity, foundation or trust. We'll have a look at a couple of examples out of the thousands that there are worldwide, and certainly in the UK. If we have a look at the next slide, it's just one example amongst many. It's the Leverhulme Trust. So there's an example of a great foundation built upon industrial enterprise and activity from the 19th century, which still exists in the form of a trust based upon endowments, investments, which is dedicated in a great part to improving knowledge and providing education opportunities. And that includes postgraduate funding. And the Leverhulme Trust are quite a significant player in the area of charitable funding. And if you go to their website, you'll see the different schemes. They've got 14 at the moment on the website. Follow them on Twitter, you'll get the latest news, etc. So it's up to you to target in your area of study or interest the groups or the individual organisations which are relevant to you, learn about how they work, make contact with them, and you may well find that in there is some funding for you, which you may not have really thought about previously. The next slide is an example that we've been using for years, and there's a good reason for that. It's the Anglo-Danish Society. And having mentioned that institutions in industry or medicine, science, etc., and trade have their own institutions and research foundations, so do study abroad or sort of, partnerships between countries. So the Anglo-Danish Society is one example amongst many international partnership and collaboration societies. And they provide funding for students from the UK who want to study at postgraduate level at a certain number of universities in Denmark, and they provide the same opportunity coming in the other direction. And in all the years that we've been talking about postgraduate funding, we've never come across anybody who's taken up one of these scholarships. And that's because it is very, very specific. Of course, it's really only relevant to people who are thinking of going to study at certain universities in Denmark and coming the other way. But that actually points to just how much opportunity is there. If you're part of that small group of students for whom that's relevant, you actually stand quite a decent chance of getting an Anglo-Danish Society scholarship, and they are quite substantial and can make the difference between studying or not. And the point there is that, of course, this model is replicated across so many other areas. And if you are relevant and eligible, then you should always make the application to this sort of organisation, because there is a lot of funding resource tucked away. How do you find that out? Well, if we have a look at the next slide, please. There's an incredibly useful resource called the Grants Register. It's an absolute goldmine of information. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's accessible through libraries and university careers services, and you can find some of it online. So we would urge you to look into the Grants Register, because it really is the best place to go for global information on postgraduate funding. But also fundsonline.org and charitychoice.co.uk are, in addition, very, very useful reference sources. And of course, on the Prospects website, if you look under the scholarships and bursaries area, which is one of the most popular parts of our postgraduate funding information, we list a lot of these schemes and opportunities as well. So we're always very keen to emphasise just how important charities, foundations and trusts are, in addition to the other schemes and opportunities that we've looked at so far, because they do tend to get overlooked. They are not, however, the final word in opportunities. If we move on, please, to the next slide in the presentation, we will have a look at the wonderful world of university funding. And this is, for many of you who are still at university, thinking about postgraduate study, or have been to university and are thinking of going back to it, it's kind of under your nose in many ways. And universities are really, really good sources of funding. It comes in many, many different ways, particularly studentships, awards, scholarships, bursaries, etc. Every university will have some form of funding, like a scholarship or a studentship, available, and it's up to you to look on the fees and funding pages on the website, and ask the question. Always ask the question about funding when you're making your inquiry to the department, the faculty where you're studying. Ask students who are currently or have been postgraduate students, did they take advantage of any university funding? Because it's a really, really lucrative source of funding. And universities, of course, use it in their recruitment very effectively as well. To take one example out of many, University of Brighton offer £3,000 scholarships for undergraduates who are going on to do postgraduate study at that university. And that is a very, very common form of funding. Most universities will offer some sort of incentive for their undergraduates to become postgraduates. They may also offer discounts, maybe 25% discount on postgraduate fees if you have been studying already at that university. Because, of course, universities want to keep their students. They want to keep them in the institution. And for the student's point of view, it's already a known quantity, and you're moving fairly seamlessly into the next level of study. So find out as much as you can about studentships. They are increasingly advertised very, very prominently, but sometimes there may be schemes which are very specific and only become available for a short period. And that's where, as with every other aspect of your information journey, you need to really do the research and keep on top of what the latest developments are. But universities, of course, provide funding in other ways too, directly or indirectly. For research students, a graduate teaching or research assistantship is quite a popular and common way of covering fees, for example, or getting a cost of living grant. And they often may be comparable to research council funding. And if you've been an undergraduate, you may well have been taught by a postgraduate student or had your work assessed or contributed to in other ways. So that is a way for research students to both study and work at the same time. Of course, part-time campus work, which at the moment, of course, is generally in abeyance, but will return when things return to normal next year. So universities are huge employers. If you think about where they sit in local economies, they are very, very significant. And as in terms of providing opportunities to students for jobs on campus or around campus, then they are very, very prominent economic players. Hall tutorships are not that common, but we do hear about them from time to time, and that's where you may get your fees covered or a cost of living or wage for taking on duties like being a warden or helping out in a hall of residence or some other student-focused area. And we've mentioned alumni discount, but also fee flexibility, the opportunity perhaps to pay your fees in instalments rather than all up front may give you a bit more flexibility and opportunity. And with all of this, it's important, if it's not made prominent, always ask the question about funding. It's as important as any other question that you're going to ask when you approach a university, whether that be at a fair, an online event, or just talking to people over email. So the funding question is number one, and universities are hugely important funding providers. Could we move to the next slide, please? Because we're now sort of stepping away from the where you can get money from, if you like, whether it be a loan or a grant or a scholarship or an award. And returning to the point we began with, which has been the traditional way, the traditional route for postgraduate students. And in spite of the popularity and comprehensiveness of the postgraduate loan scheme and research funding and all the other systems that are in place, thousands of postgraduates are still supporting themselves fundamentally. And they do that by putting together a funding package, sometimes referred to as a funding portfolio, where they may draw upon a university scholarship. They may get something from a charity, a foundation, or a trust. We've known of students who've done crowdfunding and have been successful with it in order to pay at least some of their fees to go on to postgraduate study. But the principal way of doing it is by working and studying at the same time. And that may be in part-time work or sometimes in full-time work as well, because part-time study is still popular for postgraduate students, and it's not unusual to find postgrads combining the two. And nobody pretends that is easy or straightforward, but it's certainly doable and achievable, and has been the common experience for decades for hundreds of thousands of postgraduate students. Now, it makes a lot of sense when we think about the importance of employability, which we covered at the beginning, because employability covers many different qualities and virtues. It's about the way you direct yourself in terms of your working life. It's about the skills that you acquire. It's about the balance that you strike between training, study, and practice. So actually doing a course which is designed to improve your employability and working at the same time is actually a very useful dynamic combination. And many students are undertaking that actually with sponsorship from their employer. You may find that your employer requires you to do a course of further study. It may be at postgraduate level, it may be at diploma level, certificate level, it may be a short course or training. However it manifests itself, if you're going to work somewhere, and you hope you will be, that is serious about training and development, then postgraduate study may well be part of that. So it may well be a requirement for you. Obviously, if you are retraining and you've done an undergraduate course in geography or chemistry and you want to be a teacher or a lawyer, then of course you will be doing a vocational course of study which will enable you to enter those professions and get trained in that way. You may find you're starting work and you develop an interest in marketing or IT, and your work takes you in that direction. And at that point, you may actually make a case to your employer to support you through a course of further study. You may do a business case. You may be asked, of course, to justify that, but that is not an unusual sort of course of events. Your employer may well require you to sign a commitment to say that if you leave within a certain amount of time after doing that course, having got yourself to a much higher level and become even more employable than you were, then you may have to pay back the fee. So there may be commitments and constraints in that. But it is actually a very sensible way of thinking about postgraduate study. Because after all, it does not have to be done immediately. Nobody should ever feel under pressure to rush into doing a master's or anything else. Certainly not because they don't know what else to do, but even because it's a credible idea, but there may be other opportunities to explore. So sometimes going into work, establishing yourself, starting to build your career, that point, it may well be the time to do a course which is going to improve your prospects in that firm and take you elsewhere in the future. Employer sponsorship is a very important part of it, and working and studying is still, for many people, the reality of postgraduate study. And it's a combination which has a lot of qualities. It's certainly demanding, and it's certainly time consuming. But we find research after research, talking to postgraduate students, the general consensus is, however demanding it was and however much commitment was required, even to the extent of making some sacrifices in terms of time and life, etc., almost without exception, postgraduates speak not only warmly, but extremely highly of their postgraduate experience. And that is the case whether it's the purpose of it has been to improve job opportunities, employability, or to just enrich their personal understanding of a subject that they love. Because all of these reasons, if you're able to do it and it's the right time to do it and you can support yourself through it, all of these reasons are incredibly important and incredibly valuable when it comes to doing postgraduate study. And it's still the case now. We've seen this year a great spike in the number of students going on to postgraduate study, and that is a reflection of the economic circumstances of the time. So people going into further study in order to emerge into a better job market next year, or a different job market next year, even more qualified and employable. But it's the case for students at any stage in it, frankly. So postgraduate study, as I mentioned at the start, has never been more important. It's never been in greater demand. And finally, we're at a stage where the funding has kept pace. It has kept pace with the increase in postgraduate study and its popularity. And from what we've looked at in this short amount of time, I trust will have encouraged you to see that there are ways of supporting yourself. And it may be that you take out a loan. It doesn't have to be the entire amount, £11,222 in England at the moment. It may be a fraction of that. It may be all of it. It may be rolled in with your undergraduate loan. You may decide to do none of those things. You may put together a funding portfolio and a funding package. But whichever of those routes that you choose, you need to do as much research as possible. And time is on your side. If you're thinking of applying for next year, of course, you're starting your information journey at exactly the right time. So do treat, and this is the final message that we would like to give to you at this moment, do treat the funding search as seriously as you treat the research into the course and the university that you go to. The two are totally interrelated, and you give yourself the best possible opportunity of having the best possible postgraduate experience if you undertake that research now and do it as seriously as you can. So we'll finish the talking part of it in that sense, and we'll go back and have a look at some questions and round things off over the next few minutes.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, we've got time for a couple of questions here. There's one from Graham. As a more mature student just completing a master's, are PhD loans available for the over 50s?
Yes, they are indeed. And if you go to the pages on the Prospects website, we'll provide some clarity on that. But if we can bring that up at the moment. It should be absolutely. Yes, the age limit, and I just wanted to clarify that before saying it live, you have to be under the age of 60 on the first day of the academic year. And that's the same for the master's loan as well, incidentally.
Right, thanks. And we've got a question from Amy. Are there any options? Funding options for doing a second master's?
That's a very good question. I think you'd need to contact, depending which part of the country you're in, if it's in England, the student finance company, and see about how returning ones. I'm not 100% sure on that. So I think that's definitely something you'd need to take up with the finance providers.
Okay, thanks. We do have time for a couple more, and there's a couple of questions that do seem to sort of come up quite regularly, and one was about repaying the loan. So, would you repay your postgraduate loan after you finished repaying your undergraduate loan?
Yeah, that's a very common question. That, and the answer is no. It's all bound up together, and it's an interesting point, that, because there was some feeling in 2016 when the postgraduate loan scheme was announced that students might be deterred from undertaking another loan, and it certainly wasn't the case. And I think there was a certain amount of pragmatism, which was, well, you're paying one debt off, and trading the benefits of doing further studying, and the extent to which it makes you more qualified and general development. It's worth folding that in. So it does get included in it, and so far that doesn't seem to have been a deterrent at all. I should qualify that by saying, with the question of funding generally, it's obviously a very personal one. So we wouldn't be in the position of advocating people taking on more debt, but it's important that everybody knows the schemes are available. And it's certainly true that the advent of those loan schemes has really changed the landscape, and it has encouraged many more students to do postgraduate study. And the demand for those loans in the first year far outstripped what the government's expectation of them was. And as I say, the fact that it's included in your undergraduate one does not seem to have been a deterrent, certainly.
Very quickly, one last one. Can I get a postgraduate loan for studying a postgraduate diploma?
You cannot. No, the loan schemes are just for master's level study and for PhD level study. But some of the other funding schemes, and certainly when it comes to looking at things like charities, foundations and trusts, or if you're doing a postgraduate diploma at a university, then there may well be bursaries and schemes available for students there. But it does, at the moment, it sits outside of the big national loan schemes. Absolutely.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Chris, for answering the questions and for your presentation. Thanks to everybody for joining us, because just about out of time. And someone did just ask if this will be available to review later. It's being recorded, so I'm assuming it will be available on demand as part of the Future You live event. So you can come back and see this again, hopefully. Right, thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.